there were a whole host of issues. And then we started thinking from the list of possibilities that we were working with, which ones would resonate with the university community. And we know that the issue of war is and always has been of great concern on college campuses. And so that was probably the final element to make us head in that direction. And then we also had a really good conversation with Dr. Bodman, which helped us make that decision too. We knew of Dr. Bodman over at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and at first set up an appointment to go speak with him to gather from him some ideas about how we would proceed. And we have Dr. Bodman to thank, really, for the shape and the form of the forum as it came to be. And we do hope, in fact, that he, as professor of comparative religions over at Austin Presbyterian, might be helpful for us in forums down the road, because he's got that special expertise and contacts in the community that were just so helpful for us this time. Rabbi David Komorowski is the executive director of the Hillel Association here on UT's campus. And we went over to interview him to see if he'd be interested in participating in the forum. And within the first 15 seconds of that time with him, we knew he was the right guy. He has a wonderful sense of humor. He's very engaging. And on top of all that, he is very, very well versed in Jewish religious history and thought. And so we knew right from that interview that he was the guy. Dr. Garcia is a professor at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which is just on the other side of campus from us here. His area of expertise is Christian ethics and social issues. So a discussion on the morality of war was right down his alley. And he also, once he heard what we were trying to do with the forum, was very ready to jump in and be a part of the plan. We asked Dr. Bodman, you know, who would possibly do a good job for us in this? And he said, Dr. Azam really is your only good choice in the area here. And so when we approached her, actually Craig Bell, our chief organizer on the church's end of the forum, really wouldn't take no for an answer, and he approached her again, I think even a third time, before she finally said, well, okay, I'll do it. And as it turns out, she was a fantastic participant in the program. We really benefited from having her. We know this is a wonderful panel of presenters on each of their religious traditions, and we have the finest moderator we could have around, so enjoy the forum this afternoon.
The questions that I will be asking initially have been shared among us, and we have worked on them, so they will not come as a surprise. I figure that you will be responsible for the surprises. The title of this forum presumes that that conflict is a part of human life, and certainly has been a part of human history. So the first question that I want to ask, and I will start with Dr. Azam, is what kinds of violence does your religion sanction?
Overall, I think we could divide classical jihad theory, and I'm using the word jihad here because that is what would be the broadest term to refer to warfare, even though there are other meanings for jihad. Essentially, jihad theory covers interstate warfare, so both for defensive as well as offensive purposes, and I'll hopefully have a chance to elaborate on that later. And there, the important point to keep in mind is that classically there's been a bit of a tension or ambiguity over what are the legitimate aims of warfare. The second legitimated use of violence is intrastate. So the state is regarded as having a right to maintain law and order within its boundaries, and that effectively means quashing rebellion or insurgency. There, the most important point to keep in mind is that there has been debate within the classical tradition over what constitutes legitimate rebellion versus illegitimate rebellion against the state. And so we'll have a chance to talk about that perhaps as well later. And then thirdly, Islamic law permits the use of violence by the state in the enforcement of its laws. This falls not under jihad, but rather under what we would think of as policing or enforcement of court decisions. So, for example, it is permissible for the state to incarcerate criminals and also to carry out certain bodily punishments that we may or may not be familiar with, those of you who have studied Islamic law. So those are essentially the three types of violence that are sanctioned within the Islamic tradition, the classical Islamic tradition.
Yeah, the issue of violence goes at the heart of the identity of the Christian community because it is a negation of what we call the Prince of Peace. So violence has always been something that is very troublesome for us. And in many ways, it follows, I think, the attitudes of other religious traditions. Christians would justify violence if it has to do with the preservation of social order. They would justify violence if it has to do with an issue related to justice, like the liberation of the poor or the defense of the innocent. And they might justify violence when it has to do to the preservation of some very important value like equality or freedom or justice. In those cases, you can make an exception to what has been seen as the core of the Christian tradition, which is a nonviolent attitude. That is, that peace is the way that Christians should behave. So what you have is, in the tradition, what would excuse us from not complying with peace? That will be social order, justice, and some other equally strong value like equality and freedom.
The first instance of sanctioned violence in Judaism is self-defense. That if someone is what is categorized as a rodef, or a pursuer, who is coming after you to kill you, you are commanded to kill that person, not just out of self-defense, but so that you prohibit that person from committing the sin of murder. It's a little backwards thinking. But in order to stop them from committing murder, and perhaps it's a psychological justification, but certainly self-defense, we are commanded to save our own lives. And then there are sanctioned wars in Judaism, three different kinds. One is what's called a milchemet mitzvah, or a commanded war. This would be something in which we're commanded for purposes of self-defense to not just defend ourselves individually, but defend the entity of the Jewish people. The second is what's called milchemet reshut, or the discretionary war, which really isn't applicable anymore, but it was applicable a long time ago with King David trying to expand the borders of biblical Israel. And the third would be a preemptive or preventative war, so that for the greater good, in order to stop the pursuer, we preempt them or prevent them from harming us.
Because this is kind of interesting. In the Christian tradition, we've been kind of dual in this issue. Augustine used to reject self-defense as a justification for war. The reason for that was Augustine wanted to somehow bring violence in relationship with love. And the problem with self-defense was that it was too selfish, which was the origin of sin. Aquinas later on, however, said, well, no. If I'm of the same value as someone else, and the community